On a rain-soaked evening in February 1938, inside a modest study overlooking the Chesapeake Bay, Edgar Cayce delivered what would become one of his most haunting and transformative readings ever recorded. The question that prompted this extraordinary session came from Dr. Helena Marchfield, a prominent Baltimore physician whose husband had died suddenly 3 months earlier. Her inquiry was simple yet profound. What is Thomas experiencing right now? Where is his consciousness and what is he learning? What Cayce revealed in the next 2 hours would fundamentally change how humanity understands the journey of the soul immediately following physical death. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dr. Marchfield wasn't seeking comfort through wishful thinking. As one of the few female physicians practicing in Maryland during the 1930s, she approached death with clinical detachment, having witnessed hundreds of patients transition from life to whatever lay beyond. Yet when her own husband, a respected literature professor at Johns Hopkins University, collapsed from a massive heart attack while grading student papers, her scientific rationality crumbled beneath waves of desperate grief and burning questions that medical school had never addressed. Thomas Marchfield had been more than a spouse to Helena. He was her intellectual companion, her anchor in a male-dominated profession, and her closest friend for over 15 years of marriage. His sudden departure left her not only emotionally devastated, but intellectually tormented by questions that haunted her days and sleepless nights. If consciousness survived bodily death, what was that experience actually like? Was Thomas confused, frightened, at peace? Did he retain his memories, his personality, his love for her? Traditional religious authorities had offered her platitudes about heaven and eternal rest, but these vague assurances felt hollow to someone trained in empirical observation. The medical community she belonged to dismissed such concerns entirely, viewing death as simply the cessation of biological function. Neither approach satisfied her need for specific, detailed understanding of what her husband might be experiencing in his current state of existence. Word of Edgar Cayce's extraordinary abilities had reached Dr. Marchfield through whispered conversations in hospital corridors and medical conferences. Colleagues spoke in hushed tones about the sleeping prophet who could diagnose illnesses with impossible accuracy and describe events happening thousands of miles away. Some claimed he could peer beyond the veil of death itself, providing detailed accounts of consciousness beyond the physical realm. When Cayce entered his characteristic trance state that February evening, the atmosphere in the room seemed to shift in ways that defied rational explanation. The 3 witnesses present, including a court stenographer and a university psychology professor, later described feeling an unusual sense of anticipation, as if the very air had become charged with otherworldly energy. The rain against the windows seemed to quiet, and even the grandfather clock in the corner appeared to tick more softly. Speaking in his deep, measured trance voice, Cayce began describing Thomas Marchfield's current experience with a precision that left everyone present stunned into absolute silence. The entity known in Earth life as Thomas Marchfield, Cayce intoned, finds himself in the initial phase of soul adjustment, a period of orientation lasting approximately 6 months in Earth time, though time itself functions differently in these realms of consciousness. What followed was perhaps the most detailed description of early afterlife experience ever documented through any psychic source. According to Cayce's reading, the first 6 months following physical death constitute a crucial transition period where the soul gradually releases its attachment to earthly existence while awakening to its true, spiritual nature. This process, he explained, occurs in 3 distinct phases, each lasting roughly 2 months and serving specific purposes in the soul's continuing evolution. During the first phase, which Cayce termed the period of recognition, the newly deceased soul maintains strong connections to its earthly identity and environment. Thomas, he revealed, was experiencing a state of expanded awareness where he could perceive both his former physical surroundings and new spiritual dimensions simultaneously. He remained close to Helena, drawn by their deep emotional bond, able to sense her grief and attempting to communicate comfort through dreams, sudden warm sensations, and subtle environmental signs. The reading continued with Cayce describing how Thomas retained his full personality, memories, and capacity for love, but was gradually discovering abilities that had been dormant during physical incarnation. He could move through space by intention rather than physical effort, communicate through direct consciousness transfer rather than words, and perceive the emotional and spiritual states of those he encountered with crystalline clarity. Dr. Marchfield gasped audibly when Cayce began describing specific details about Thomas's current activities. He frequently visits the university library where he once worked, Cayce explained, drawn by familiarity and his continued love of learning. He attempts to influence students who are struggling with concepts he once taught, though his ability to impact physical reality remains limited during this initial phase. Most significantly, he spends considerable time near Helena during her moments of deepest grief, sending waves of comfort that she experiences as sudden, inexplicable feelings of peace. The second phase, beginning approximately 2 months after death, involved what Cayce called the period of understanding. During this stage, Thomas would begin releasing his attachment to earthly identity while gaining deeper comprehension of his soul's true nature and purpose. The intense focus on his former life would gradually expand into awareness of his soul's broader journey across multiple incarnations. Cayce described this phase as potentially challenging, as the soul begins to perceive patterns of behavior, choices, and relationships that extended far beyond the most recent lifetime. Thomas would start recognizing souls he had encountered in previous incarnations, understanding the karmic connections that had drawn certain people into his most recent life experience, and gaining insight into lessons his soul had been working to master across centuries of earthly existence. The final phase of the 6-month transition period, Cayce explained, represented the time of preparation, where the soul would begin making decisions about its next stage of development. Some souls, he revealed, chose to remain in spiritual realms for extended periods of study and service. Others felt called to reincarnate relatively quickly to continue working on specific spiritual lessons, or to fulfill commitments made to other souls before birth. What made this reading particularly extraordinary was Cayce's description of the environment Thomas was experiencing during this transition. Rather than finding himself in some vague heavenly realm, Thomas existed in a dimension that closely paralleled physical reality but operated according to different laws. Buildings, landscapes, and even libraries existed in these realms, created through collective consciousness and serving as familiar gathering places for souls in various stages of development. According to Cayce's vision, Thomas was currently residing in what could best be described as a spiritual university, a vast complex of learning centers where souls studied subjects ranging from the nature of love and forgiveness to the cosmic laws governing reincarnation and spiritual evolution. He attended lectures given by advanced souls who had completed their earthly incarnation cycles, participated in group discussions with other recently deceased individuals, and spent preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Considerable time in meditation and self-reflection. The reading continued with Cayce addressing Dr. Marchfield's most pressing personal concerns. Thomas remained fully aware of her love and their shared history, he explained, and their bond continued to strengthen even across dimensional boundaries. The professor emphasized that earthly relationships based on genuine love do not end with physical death but evolve into spiritual partnerships that can extend across multiple lifetimes. More remarkably, Cayce described how Thomas was actively preparing for eventual reunion with Helena, not necessarily in his current spiritual realm, but through carefully orchestrated future incarnations where their souls could continue their joint evolution. Love, Cayce stressed, creates spiritual momentum that draws souls together across time, space, and even species, ensuring that connections forged in deep affection will find expression in whatever form serves the highest spiritual development of all involved. The implications of this reading extended far beyond personal comfort for one grieving widow. If Cayce's descriptions were accurate, they suggested that death was not an ending but a graduation, a transition from one phase of existence to another more expansive and purposeful stage of consciousness development. The first 6 months represented a crucial adjustment period, where souls maintained continuity with their earthly identity, while gradually awakening to their eternal spiritual nature. During the weeks following this extraordinary reading, Dr. Marchfield began experiencing phenomena that seemed to validate many of Cayce's specific predictions. She reported unusually vivid dreams where Thomas appeared exactly as Cayce had described him, retaining his personality and memories while displaying new capabilities and deeper wisdom. In these dream encounters, Thomas would share insights about her patients that proved remarkably helpful in her medical practice. More compelling still, Helena began noticing synchronicities that suggested Thomas's continued influence in her daily life. Books would fall open to passages that addressed her current concerns, patients would mention topics that Thomas had been passionate about, and she frequently encountered people who reminded her strongly of her deceased husband in mannerisms and perspectives she had never noticed before. Word of this profound reading spread quietly through networks of spiritually minded physicians, professors, and researchers. Throughout the late 1930s and early 1940s, dozens of similar cases came to Cayce's attention, each one adding layers of detail to his emerging understanding of early afterlife experience. During a particularly moving session in 1940, Cayce consulted with the parents of Lieutenant Robert Chen, a young Navy pilot whose plane had been shot down over the Pacific. The lieutenant's parents, both Chinese immigrants who had built successful businesses in San Francisco, were struggling to reconcile their traditional Buddhist beliefs about death and reincarnation with their grief over losing their only son. In this reading, Cayce described how Lieutenant Chen was experiencing the first phase of his afterlife transition while maintaining his strong connection to military service and his love for flying. The young pilot, Cayce explained, found himself in spiritual training programs alongside other souls who had died in service to their countries, learning advanced lessons about courage, sacrifice, and the spiritual principles underlying just warfare. What made this case particularly fascinating was Cayce's description of how Lieutenant Chen was preparing for a future incarnation where he would continue serving others, possibly as a healer or teacher rather than a warrior. The soul, Cayce explained, uses the first 6 months after death to evaluate the lessons learned in the most recent lifetime and plan how to apply this wisdom in future incarnations designed to accelerate spiritual growth. The lieutenant's parents reported that within days of this reading, they began receiving dreams and synchronistic experiences that confirmed many of Cayce's specific details. Most remarkably, their son appeared to his mother in a vivid dream, wearing his naval uniform but surrounded by a golden light, explaining that his death had not been a tragedy but a graduation to higher service. As the 1940s progressed, Cayce gave dozens of readings about the first 6 months after death, each one contributing to a comprehensive understanding of this crucial transition period. What emerged was not a collection of comforting platitudes, but a detailed map of consciousness development that challenged both religious doctrine and scientific materialism. According to Cayce's accumulated wisdom on this subject, the first 6 months following physical death served multiple essential purposes in the soul's eternal journey. Primary among these was the gradual release of earthly attachments and identities that, while necessary for physical incarnation, could limit spiritual growth if maintained beyond their usefulness. During the first 2 months, Cayce consistently described, souls remained intensely connected to their most recent earthly experience. They retained their familiar personality, their emotional attachments to family and friends, their professional interests, and even their personal preferences and quirks. This continuity served as a bridge between physical and spiritual existence, preventing the shock and disorientation that might otherwise accompany such a dramatic transition. However, this phase also involved growing awareness of expanded capabilities and perspectives that had been dormant during earthly life. Souls discovered they could perceive the thoughts and emotions of others with remarkable clarity, travel instantaneously to any location by focusing their intention, and communicate through direct consciousness transfer rather than verbal language. The second 2-month phase brought deeper spiritual awakening as souls began recognizing the broader patterns of their eternal journey. Past life memories would surface with increasing frequency and clarity, revealing connections between current relationships and experiences that had been repeated across multiple incarnations. Souls would start understanding the specific lessons their consciousness had been working to master, and recognizing other souls who had participated in their spiritual development across centuries. The final 2 months of this 6-month transition focused on preparation for the next stage of development. Some souls, Cayce explained, felt called to remain in spiritual dimensions for extended periods of study, service, and preparation before attempting another physical incarnation. These souls often became guides and teachers for others undergoing similar transitions. Other souls discovered urgent calls to return quickly to earthly experience, drawn by unfinished business, unfulfilled commitments to other souls, or intense desire to apply newly gained spiritual insights in physical form. These souls would work with advanced spiritual guides to plan their next incarnation, carefully selecting the circumstances, relationships, and challenges that would best serve their continuing evolution. What made Cayce's descriptions particularly compelling was his consistent emphasis on the continuation of individual personality and the power of love to transcend dimensional boundaries. Unlike religious traditions that depicted afterlife as a dissolution of individual identity into cosmic consciousness, Cayce's readings suggested that death enhanced rather than diminished personal characteristics, while expanding awareness beyond previous limitations. The souls Cayce described retained their sense of humor, their intellectual interests, their capacity for friendship, and their emotional connections to those they had loved during earthly existence. Death did not erase personality, but freed it from physical constraints, while adding new dimensions of perception and capability. Perhaps most significantly, Cayce consistently taught that the first 6 months after death represented just the beginning of a much longer spiritual journey. Souls who completed this initial transition period would face choices about their next stage of development that could span decades, centuries, or even millennia, depending on their level of spiritual advancement and their desire to serve other souls still struggling with earthly challenges. Throughout the 1940s, as reports of Cayce's afterlife readings spread beyond Virginia Beach, families across America began applying his insights to their own experiences of loss and grief. Rather than viewing death as final separation, people started recognizing it as temporary transition in eternal relationships. This perspective transformed the grieving process for many, replacing despair with patient hope and devastating loss with anticipation of eventual reunion. The practical implications of Cayce's teachings extended far beyond personal comfort. If consciousness survived death with personality intact, if souls remained connected to those they loved through bonds that transcended physical existence, if the first 6 months were spent in continued learning and growth, then earthly life took on new significance as preparation for spiritual advancement rather than a brief, meaningless interlude in an otherwise empty universe. Medical professionals who encountered Cayce's work began reporting improvements in their ability to help dying patients and grieving families. Understanding death as transition rather than termination allowed healthcare providers to approach end-of-life care with greater compassion and wisdom, helping patients prepare for their journey rather than simply fighting to postpone it. Religious leaders from various traditions found that Cayce's detailed descriptions of afterlife experience enriched rather than contradicted their theological understanding. The continuation of individual consciousness, the reality of spiritual growth beyond physical death, and the ultimate triumph of love over separation resonated with core teachings in Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, and other major spiritual traditions. During one of his most profound readings on this subject, delivered in 1944 to a gathering that included several university professors, medical doctors, and religious scholars, Cayce was asked to describe the most important thing that souls learn during their first 6 months after death. His response became one of the most quoted passages from his entire body of work. The most crucial understanding that comes to souls in this period of transition, Cayce explained from his trance state, is the recognition that love is not an emotion but a creative force, the fundamental energy that builds worlds and draws consciousness toward ever greater expressions of unity and service. Earthly life, with its apparent separations and conflicts, serves to teach souls how to generate and direct this creative force under challenging conditions. He continued with unusual intensity in his voice. When souls release their attachment to earthly limitations during these first months, they discover that every act of love, kindness, and service performed during physical incarnation has created permanent changes in the fabric of reality. Nothing given in love is ever lost. Every word of comfort, every gesture of compassion, every moment of genuine connection with another soul becomes part of an eternal network of spiritual momentum that influences the development of all consciousness throughout the universe. The scholars present exchanged meaningful glances as Cayce's reading continued. This wasn't merely comforting philosophy, but a comprehensive cosmology that positioned individual human experiences within a vast framework of universal spiritual evolution. Every life, every death, every period of transition contributed to the gradual awakening of all consciousness to its divine nature and ultimate unity. As the reading concluded, Cayce addressed the question that had been burning in every listener's mind. How can those still in physical incarnation best help souls undergoing this 6-month transition period? His answer provided practical guidance that families around the world would apply for decades to come. The most helpful thing the living can do, Cayce explained, is to release the deceased with love while maintaining spiritual connection through prayer, meditation, and continued conversation. Excessive grief and attempts to hold souls back through desperate emotional attachment can actually interfere with their natural progression through this crucial adjustment period. Instead, Cayce advised, the living should celebrate the graduate's advancement to higher learning while maintaining confidence in eventual reunion. Souls in transition remain aware of thoughts and emotions directed toward them from the physical realm, and they draw strength and encouragement from expressions of love that support their continued growth, rather than attempting to pull them backward into earthly attachments they need to release. The legacy of Edgar Cayce's revelations about the first 6 months after death continues to provide comfort and understanding to millions of people facing the loss of loved ones. His readings offered more than hope. They provided a detailed roadmap of consciousness development that honored both the continuation of individual personality and the reality of ongoing spiritual evolution. For those who have lost family members, friends, or romantic partners, Cayce's teachings suggest that their loved ones are not gone but graduated, not suffering but learning, not lost but found in ways that earthly existence had never allowed. The first 6 months represent a time of remarkable growth, renewed purpose, and preparation for even greater service in dimensions where love is the fundamental creative force. Modern research into near-death experiences, consciousness studies, and quantum physics has begun providing scientific frameworks that support many of Cayce's insights about survival of consciousness and the continuation of personality beyond physical death. While mainstream science remains cautious about definitive claims regarding afterlife experience, the consistency and detail of Cayce's readings continue to influence researchers exploring the nature of consciousness itself. Perhaps most importantly, Cayce's vision of the first 6 months after death offers a model for living that transforms how we approach both our current relationships and our inevitable transition. If death is graduation rather than termination, if love creates eternal connections that transcend dimensional boundaries, if every act of kindness contributes to universal spiritual evolution, then our daily choices take on cosmic significance. The next time you face the loss of someone dear, remember Edgar Cayce's stunning revelations about those crucial first 6 months. Your loved one is not gone but transformed, not suffering but growing, not lost but found in ways that physical existence never allowed. They remain as close as your next loving thought of them, drawing strength from your continued connection while preparing for the next stage of their eternal journey. In the grand tapestry of consciousness that Cayce revealed, death is not an ending but a commencement, not separation but expansion, not loss but discovery of the boundless nature of love itself. The first 6 months after death represent humanity's graduation ceremony from one classroom of spiritual development to another, more advanced level of learning and service. This is the stunning truth that Edgar Cayce revealed about those precious first 6 months. Consciousness doesn't end with physical death but expands, personality doesn't dissolve but enriches, and love doesn't fade but grows stronger, creating bridges between dimensions that allow souls to maintain connection while pursuing their eternal journey toward ever greater expressions of divine service and universal compassion. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.